Bon après-midi tout le monde. Welcome to this last plenary sessions on the big issue, which is climate disorder and public policy governing in a turbulent time. So we have four guest speakers, and they will talk in the order in the program. Benjamin Cashor from Yale University, Frank Fisher from Humboldt University, Amida du CNRS, et Robert Pickle from Trent University. Each of them will probably address whatever in their ways these key questions and problem, probably. We put three questions, if you look in the program, that we want them to answer. First question, what feasible strategies can nation-state adopt today to respond to environmental challenges? Second, what role can civil society play in redefining world governance over these issues? And thirdly, how can changes at the global scale satisfy the need and aspiration of human beings toward a better quality of life? And I will have the fourth one, how can we study climate change and in our policy environment, and how can we move on and do that? As we know, there's a lot of anxieties in the world about climate change, and I think that we need maybe some psychologists as well, but I think you will probably be able to answer that. If you have questions toward the meeting, you have the Twitter. Why my picture? You have the Twitter at the end you can use. You can use that to ask questions, whatever, during the conversations, and we'll do that. At the end, everybody will try to take a number of questions by round, probably by three at a time. So everybody ask your question, and then identify yourself, don't forget, and ask to who you want to ask the questions. Are you ready? Okay, let's go on. Ben, it's yours.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be on this amazing panel, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Before I begin, just a little word of warning. I'm going to be really provocative, okay? So I'm treating this as actually a seminar of a lot of people, and so don't take what I'm saying as necessarily the case, but I'm going to make some arguments that I hope can generate a conversation, okay? So please take it in that context. And with that, I will begin by recognizing at a broad level, that there is this tension in our field, our approach to policy studies, between explanatory and applied policy analysis, right? We have this constant tension between just describing and explaining the policy world, which by itself is fantastic and important, but most of us have some kind of idea about perhaps taking this knowledge to improve problems in some way. Most of us do, I think. And in fact, there's a history of this in our discipline, right? From Simon to Lasswell to Lindblom, right? These folks cared about the actual world, as we all do. And of course, Ostrom is one of the latest to think carefully about a specific kind of problem and to work backwards to think about that theoretically and practically, and then win a Nobel Prize in economics for doing that, right? So we have this tradition of doing both, for sure. And I even think, we can ask the question, do we have a moral responsibility when thinking about climate change about actually having to take our explanatory work and then translating it into an applied component? I think that's a fair question to ask given the nature of the crises that we're facing. We use the word crisis a lot in our discipline, but this is a true catastrophe about to unyield itself, right? We're getting warmer faster, and we know that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 300 years, right? So we know that scientifically, this crisis at some point can't be averted. And we know that the impacts are multitude and pervasive, right? From icebergs crashing off to increasing forest fires to even now presently the bleaching of the coral reefs. And that's just three of like a million examples, right, about these impacts. So this is a crisis, and I suspect that we have a moral responsibility to think about these problems, especially when we take into account that they're coinciding along with what is known as the sixth The 6th great extinction of the planet is happening right now. You have the honor of living through this phenomenon, okay? And it's the first one created by Homo sapiens, okay? So we've done it. We've created, and it's a million. Can you imagine that in your brain? A million species are being threatened with extinction. Not 1 or 2, but a million. It's so abstract, right? A million, and we've done it. Okay, we're responsible for it, right? So I thought I'd give you some visualizations of these, 2 out of the million, okay? So one is this sage grouse in the U.S. South, which owing to privatization of land has led to a lack of ecosystems in a very unique part of the habitat that it requires. And here's the orangutan in Borneo, right? We're about to lose the orangutan, despite having invented around 25 different policy interventions, usually market mechanisms, over the last 25 years, and we're going to lose it. Why are we going to lose it? There's this thing called palm oil that shows up in most of the things that you eat and wear, okay? And so think about this for a second, okay? Think about this for a second, that these kindergartners that you all know, maybe they're even your children, right? When they eat Oreo cookies, right, they're causing the orangutan to become extinct, okay? These little kids are doing this to our planet, right? Cute little kids are destroying the orangutan, right? So the complexities of responsibilities are very strong. This is not an Indonesian or Malaysian problem. This is a global problem that we're responsible for consumption and production. So the puzzle, I think, is, we love puzzles in our world. So the puzzle, I think, is, one puzzle is, we've known this for a long time, right? What's happening, like for 25, 30 years and even more. We've known this. And yet, the problems are getting worse. And the United Nations is one of the leading bodies to coalesce the knowledge around these problems and to develop rhetorical flourishes about how important they actually are. 12 years left, we hear. I've been hearing 12 years left for a while, but it's increasingly getting acute such that that really is the case, right? So they're worsening. So why are they worsening, and why are all of our efforts that we're throwing at these problems not capable of addressing these crises? So I got 2 hypotheses, okay? So the first one's going to be on the one that I think a lot of us probably love, power, right? So powerful interests probably don't want us to really address the problems if they come against the idea of economic growth and strong challenges to utility and all these things that we know and love, right? If that's the case, who's winning in the power dimension? And I would argue, I posit that the World Economic Forum is doing just great when it comes to the power question, right? And they've got more problem definitions than simply the orangutan or the climate crisis. And even the World Business Council is trying to balance different objectives in ways that may not be able to get us to these problem-solving challenges, but they've been heavily involved, these 2, in creating most of the policy interventions that have been applied the last 25 years. Who's not winning? I was thinking about that. Well, NRDC, not so much. Greenpeace, not at all. They're not winning at all. And nor is this girl, okay? You know her? Greta Thunberg, okay? From Sweden, who actually individually said to all of us, what are we doing, right? And how can we make a difference? And she's being a provocative voice and trying to get the crisis that is facing us to be at the forefront, right? The Baumgartner and Jones punctuated agenda setting, right, is caused by her. But she's not winning, right? She's not winning. And in fact, the powerful interests often try and co-opt rhetorically those who aren't winning, right? So the rhetoric is actually around the problem-solving stuff. But the interventions aren't even close to the rhetoric, right? They're just disconnected from each other. And so that's one hypothesis that probably has some merit, but now I'm going to get really awkward, okay? And I'm going to say actually a second hypothesis is actually us, okay, as a community. Okay, this is really going to get awkward, okay? And I'm going to argue that actually our problem conceptions about the nature of the problem itself have not been worked out enough by us and our explanatory, descriptive, and prescriptive efforts. And they've led to a drift in how we think about the problems that we're facing and the solutions that we might offer them. So I want to argue that while huge strides have been made in thinking about anticipatory policy design, we've had a lot of workshops in this conference about that, and even on policy baskets and mixes, we're really doing great on that. There's been a failure to make these findings contingent on very distinct problem conceptions. So I want to argue that we're trying to generalize across all problem types, and we cannot do that. And that could, in fact, be part of the reasons why we're having these challenges. And in fact, by trying to generalize across all problem types has led our community, and this is getting really awkward, to make erroneous conclusions about how we use qualitative and quantitative methods and how we bring different disciplines together. I'm going to make this point in my talk, okay? And our preferences for applied policy analysis techniques, which I'm going to argue, inadvertently prioritize some problem conceptions over others, and it's not the climate change one, okay? That's my argument, okay? So here it goes, now that it's all really, really awkward, how am I going to elaborate this? So I'm going to argue there's actually 4 problem types out there, not one, okay? And I did this table because I had this kind of crisis the last few years about my own work on market-driven governance. I kind of thought, you know, it kind of coalesced when there was this president elected, okay, where I work in the United States. And I got thinking, am I actually part of a problem of influencing policy design around market mechanisms as being innovative and productive and efficient, but actually perhaps not addressing problems? And so I got to think, and I did a lot of paper writing, and I reflected on the different problem conceptions out there in our world, and I thought that 2 questions really could help us think about disentangling very different problem conceptions. Of course, this is the 2x2 table, which we have to have anyway in an article as a norm, right? So I have the 2x2 table. But this one, I think it works. So one question is, does a problem conception reinforce some kind of economic logic or some kind of utility logic, a rational choice approach to thinking about behavior? Okay, we all know how this works in our discipline. And secondly, does the management technique that's being offered to address the problem, is it derived from a certain class of problems, or is it meant to apply to any problem at all? Okay? Now this sounds abstract, but at least 4 different ways of seeing how our world works in the applied part. So I want to argue that type 1, okay, this is economic rationales dominate, but only for a particular class of problems, captures Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning endeavors. Her problem conception, and in her first chapter of governing the commons, very clear, she's got an economic problem where human beings are rationally overharvesting a resource to the point that they will actually become depleted. But it's rational to do so because if you don't overharvest the resource, be it timber or fish or grasslands, your neighbor will. So you may as well get a short-term benefit, given there's no long-term benefit, you're all going to lose, right? And so the issue for her is working backwards, given that problem, how do you design an approach to making us not harvest more than the growth rate, right? And so she wins a Nobel Prize for identifying a 3rd option that goes beyond public ownership or privatization to look at common pool resources to institutions, and works out, you know, for 30 years on this question, but only on this class of problem. And what I want to argue is that what's happened in the environmental field is that over time, the Ostrom model, which got a lot of traction, moved to be applied to any kind of problem through traditional cost-benefit analysis that we all know and are aware of in this community, which we call win-lose optimization, where social welfare economics or cost-benefit calculations are applied to see whether a problem can be addressed. So you know the whole deal. You got a problem, whatever it is, and you apply some kind of innovation, and you assess the innovation on the basis of whether or not it enhances social welfare. And so the answer as to whether you can address the problem you care about is dependent upon whether social welfare increases or decreases. And if you can't find a solution where social welfare increases, you can't solve the problem. And so you get a nice answer, scientifically rigorous, quantitative answer about how to address this problem, okay? Or whether you can address this problem, which means that you never know whether you can address the climate crisis or the orangutan unless you get creative. And this leads to debates about discount rates. It leads to willingness to pay surveys to try and bring the environment into an economic framework, right? And this has been the story of climate governance for most of the last 30 years, okay? Discount rates are winning, economic rationales are important, and humans' social welfare is the priority here, okay? So I want to skip over to type 3 and say, another approach emerges that's, I think, common in our field is the win-lose compromise approach where multi-goal policy analysis or multi-stakeholder dispute resolution processes in an applied sense are brought to the table. You balance environmental and social with economic goals, and you get some kind of decision about how to proceed over a policy problem. But you don't know if that problem can be really solved until after the deliberation is run. This is the point of democracy and inclusion. You don't know, right? So we apply this a lot to see if problems can be solved or not, and we get the answer on the basis of whether or not the stakeholder bodies end up deciding what they decide. And so the example I often refer to illustrate this one is actually the case of Newfoundland, right? Where the scientists told Newfoundland fishers that you're over-harvesting these fish, and therefore you have to stop it, right? And so they engaged in stakeholder processes to include municipalities, workers, fishers, and so on. And they got a wonderful, trustable, open, transparent agreement about how to proceed. Now, it wasn't in line with the science of the fisheries depletion, but it was a wonderful agreement that met all of our needs about legitimacy and trust and authority. And of course, you know what happened. The species collapsed, right? So it was the wrong approach for some kinds of problems. So what I want to argue is that type 4 problems, win-lose prioritization, are actually the proper metaphor for thinking about the climate crisis and the orangutans. And this is where some problems are so important, either normatively or based on the science, that you cannot compromise if you want to address them. You must first address them, and then you can do other things after that, right? So the science of biodiversity loss is very clear. That orangutan needs a natural habitat in the Borneo jungle. So if you decide to compromise and only give it 5%, it's going to become extinct, right? So the only thing you can do if you want to save the orangutan is to find out what the science is on the orangutan habitat and then try and achieve that conservation goal, not change it, right? But we're not doing that in today's world on either climate or biodiversity loss. We're trying to find type 2 solutions, and we're undermining type 4, okay? So I want to walk us through a bit more of the type 4 one to really reinforce why I think type 4 is where we ought to be placing a lot more of our attention as scholars in the policy process, okay? So within type 4, we've, with my former doctoral student, Kelly Levin, Graham Mald, who's now the policy director at Carleton's Policy School, and Stephen Bernstein developed this notion of super wicked problems. So this is your diagram to get that visualized in your head, okay? Superman and then a play in London together, super wicked, okay? Not just wicked, which you know, Riddle Weber's famous article, this is super wicked, okay? And so just like, and so this is like just showing you, it was 2007 was the first paper and then more papers after that. But the point here is that like Ostrom, we think you ought to work backwards from the nature of the problem itself to think about your applied solution based on this class of problems. And so we said, you know, there are actually 4 features. By the way, that's owing to my wife, that graphic. Thank her for that moving clock. That's pretty awesome, right? Time is running out. At some point, it's too late to act, given this that the carbon sits in the atmosphere for 300 years, right? Secondly, no central authority, no one place to go to resolve the problem. This one's tough. Those seeking to end the problem is also causing it. If we drew a line around all of us and we said, okay, you're a country, we'd be the highest emitting country in the world because academics love to fly and go to conferences and we love to care about the world, right? And so we're walking contradictions. It's with ourselves, this one, okay, which is tough. And then finally, the policy responses are irrational. We don't mean the economist version of hyperbolic discounting being irrational. We mean irrational based on the climate science. The 1 million species, that's irrational, okay? The catastrophic ecological effects we're not coming close to addressing, right? So when these 4 things exist, and they do in the climate case, we say, therefore work backwards from that to think about solutions. So we actually agree with Ostrom to go work backwards, unlike types 2 and 3, but it's a different kind of problem. And therefore it's not an Ostrom problem. The metaphor of collective action, which comes from Ostrom, that framed type 2, is the wrong metaphor for thinking about these problems that we're facing. Instead, we argue that path dependency analysis is a much better metaphor, which, as we know, in this community, has now been given a lot of attention on this case, right? So we actually are at the forefront of path dependency in this regard, right? And this is because path dependency thinks about constraining our short-term economic interests to our long-term ecological concerns. We care about the world beyond our own utility, right? But we always have a problem with the fact that our short-term interventions don't align with our long-term moral values, right? So path dependency is one way to do that, especially the notion of critical junctures, where you create these critical junctures on purpose and they steer you in the future towards a low-carbon pathway that might actually address this climate crisis. And so the notion here, that, of course, from the policy world, is finding these easy-to-pull levers that are hard to reverse. And they're geographics again. Easy-to-pull levers, hard to reverse, right? Is, we think, an appropriate way to proceed on the climate case. And we've got lots of people, again, Andy Jordan, Tony Zito, Frank Giel, Hoppen, Bernstein, a bunch of people working on this very question right now that I think our community can do a good job of actually helping out society with. But what's important for my talk, though, and I think that which confronts a lot of our existing assumptions, is that the methodological emphasis changes dramatically with type 4 problem solving. So we're now in this large N data-driven world, large N data is better, we can be more sophisticated, right? But I want to argue that actually the priority disciplines and methods involving type 4 problem solving are actually the historical, the qualitative process tracing, the discursive policy analysis techniques, these things that actually are being undermined all around the world in the name of type 2 rigorous quantitative methods. Now, that's kind of provocative, but I think it's actually probably true, is the priority disciplines. These are the ones that actually matter more, methods rather, and the disciplines therefore are history, philosophy, law, historical sociology, and political science, some strands of geography. They're not getting the funding. For the World Business Council and from Davos. They're not getting the funding. Yet these ones, I think, offer a lot of promise for thinking carefully about how to do this and to do it in an important way. So I want to argue, therefore, that we're getting policy conception drift that we need to be really aware of when thinking about how to proceed given type 4 problems if we care about them. And both power and methodological hegemony are to blame, both, okay? So think about this. In 1972, the United States was the leader of type 4 policy reforms. The Endangered Species Act says that you must list species that are threatened with endangerment or extinction, and you cannot take into account economic factors when doing so, just the science. This is the United States law. The United States, okay, where I live right now, did that in 1972, right? And in 1992, my first research project, those laws had path-dependent effects. And when the science said to save this endangered species, the northern spotted owl, guess what? They did it, okay? And they undermined the logging industry, yes. The companies lost, but the owl won in a type 4 solution. This is not new. This is old type 4 thinking. We just don't do it anymore, but we used to do it a lot. 2019, it's all changed, right? Even the United Nations Environment Program, I would argue type 2 now dominates its thinking. It's about economic logics for addressing these ecological catastrophes. Utility is the solution, not the problem. World Economic Forum, type 2 totally. World Bank, type 2 totally. Even my own school, a professional environment school that was transformed in 72 to be type 4, is now, I would argue, type 2. And big data is driving our answers to our solutions. And even the new policy school at Yale is justified on the basis of getting type 2 big data answers to all of our questions, okay? It's dominating. Type 3 dominates United Nations, largely. Ever since Brundtland, you balance environmental, social, and economic goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are all type 3. They're in Newfoundland. Okay, the rhetoric is type 4, but their approach is type 3. Newfoundland, totally, okay? And so, therefore, it gets even more interesting because our own scholarly community has drifted. So this is David Victor is a really great political scientist, international relations on climate change. Fantastic work. This is his take on the Paris Accord. It transformed climate diplomacy from past gridlock by creating flexibility. So this is a pretty amazing positive take. And then he says in the same article, oh, but forget about the goals of the policy itself, okay? Which in our world, generally that's not how you think about transformation. We think about that being meeting the goals, okay? In this case, the accord itself is the more important focus than the actual goals. So how do you overcome policy consumption drift? Again, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and my time's up. So one drift is to acknowledge that the applied technical skills we teach, including multi-goal policy analysis, cost-benefit analysis, even scenario development, often implicitly reflect different moral philosophies about whether humans matter more than the environment and how to handle that problem. And they also prioritize different methods and disciplines and research priorities and funding opportunities over others, okay? And that has profound impacts for this drift that I think we need to confront and acknowledge. There's a huge risk that big data turn will actually prioritize type 2 over type 4 if we're not careful. So we've got to be vigilant about this challenge. And to do that, I think, therefore, when we do our research, if we're going to be applied at all, and I think there's a moral reason why we should be applied on this question, we've got to begin and end with problem conception assessments. So I'm not arguing that we must embrace type 4 problem solving, since society and policymakers may decide not to. That's up to them, right? I'm saying that if we want to address type 4 problems, and I certainly think there's a moral compelling reason to do so, then we got to guard against conception drift. When reflecting on our explanatory projects over the next 10 years, what do we want to do in the next 10 years? Is big data really the answer? And secondly, about decisions about how to teach and apply forward-looking policy analysis. Okay, there, I've done being provocative. My talk is now over, okay? Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I guess my question follows Ben's. He presented this very worrisome scenario, picture of where we stand. So my question is, how can people close their eyes? How can people deny the climate crisis? What are they up to? And what does this mean for policy science? How should we approach this? Which is also where Ben concluded. The task of policy science, of course, is to provide policy decision makers with the best available empirical information. In fact, the discipline has largely evolved around evidence-oriented, relatively technocratic methods and principles. This has been especially the case in environmental policymaking, given the strong technical component related to the issue. Nowhere are empirical facts more important than in climate change policy, where the IPCC, where its empirical projections concerning global warming have been central to political and policy debates. Indeed, no other factual information has been more fundamental to the rise of post-truth and the emergence of alternative facts, one of the most troubling political issues of our turbulent time. Post-truth is defined, I'm not very good at remembering to do this, post-truth is defined as a situation in which the facts become less important, with the role of emotions coming to play a stronger role in public policy. Needless to say, this becomes a serious concern for an evidence-based policy analysis, an evidence-informed policy analysis, especially in climate change policy. It's led environmental scientists and policy experts, not surprisingly, to argue that the public is irrational. We showed them the facts and they just don't get it. With the main strategy being more and better policy-related facts, along with fact-checking, something of a media obsession, at least if you watch CNN. Accompanying this has been a wide-ranging discussion about how this came about, this climate denial. How, in a time of complex environmental problems, could so many people give up on the idea of truth and facts? In both the academic and popular journalistic literature, it has been common to point the finger at postmodernism, postmodern philosophy, and its social constructivist view of knowledge. In fact, just the other day here, somebody asked me how to explain that, and what should they tell their positivist colleagues who say that it's postmodernism. But I argue this is based on a misunderstanding as it relates to both constructivism and climate denial. Actually, I have a paper in critical policy studies that spells this out. First, it should be noted that there is scant evidence that the deniers are sitting around reading Karl Mannheim, Peter Berger, and Luckman. But more to the point, social constructivism does not belong to postmodernism. It has its own long history and precedes postmodernism. Moreover, there are various forms of constructivism, some related to a political agenda, and some are essentially a methodological perspective. Following Berger, who was actually a conservative economist, sociologist who often engaged in public debates, he insisted that social constructivism had nothing to do with postmodernism. It is important, he argued, to rescue the methodological orientation from the critique of postmodernism, especially when it comes to understanding climate denial. Rather than bearing the responsibility for climate denial, it is in fact the way, this is my argument, to understand how post-truth arguments are constructed. Without going into detail here, constructivism is a contextual orientation for understanding social action and the reasons that motivate it. Check this out here. Yeah, it's okay. A contextual orientation for understanding social action and the reasons that motivate it. It's enough here to say that constructivism makes clear that there are subjective elements involved in the construction of knowledge, environmental or otherwise. It's grounded as such in social meanings drawn from the social system of which the investigators are themselves a part. Environmental knowledge, like all knowledge, is understood as constructed by a community of inquirers, as opposed to the outcome of purely objective measurement and analysis. It recognizes that the environmental science community, to recognize that it is actually a social group, like any social group, with interests, hierarchies, and purposes that can be studied sociological, and that's what scholars of science studies do in significant part. But this does not mean that there are no environmental facts or that everything is relative. It's rather that environmental facts are the products of an informed consensus with the scientific community, and that new understandings of empirical realities, by their very nature of the process, are subject to reconsideration and revision. The value of constructivism lies in the fact, in its effort to understand the way objective and subjective factors interact to form such a consensus, a point that climate denial arguments serve to illustrate. When we look closer, take a closer look, we see that it is social factors rather than the facts that mainly motivate these climate deniers. In particular, the implications of the climate data for their ideological beliefs. Okay, they deny the data and so forth, but it's not really what concerns them. As Naomi Klein has shown, based on her attendance at a Heartland Institute annual conference. Heartland Institute is the home base of climate denial. The debates were primarily about the social implications of the evidence rather than the evidence herself. This was her basic observation. Climate change, oops, let me do this here. There's Mannheim and Berger, and here is Klein. Climate change politics, the deniers argue, is more about shackling capitalism and the American way of life than it is about environmental conditions. Environmentalism is seen to advance, these are their arguments, distilled, summarized, environmentalism is seen to advance causes, this is their words, dear to the political left. Redistribution of wealth, higher taxes, greater government intervention, regulation, and is portrayed as a green Trojan horse, a strategy to steal individual freedom, protected by type 2 analysis, by imposing a left political agenda. That's what they worry about. Others go further, arguing that the IPCC climate scientists are the functionaries of a hidden cabal of deep state subversives made up of Democrats, intelligence community members, high-level global officials, numerous celebrities, and nefarious policy elites. As some deniers conclude themselves, the data is actually not their pressing issue, leading Klein to realize that it isn't the real message. Rather, the message is that revered ideas and values of American culture, Western culture, are under frontal attack and in serious jeopardy. As one put it, the recipe for massive increase in government, that's the recipe. Before we take this step, let's take another look at the science. Another says, let's not simply accept this as an article of faith, these numbers. Let's actually do our own research. And this is really pretty rich, but they call for the proper use of scientific procedures. This can be written off as a stall tactic, which it surely in part is, but deniers can formally argue, albeit cynically, that the case has not been proven. What does that mean? Given that climate change data has not in fact been proven, so the argument, it cannot be the basis for policymaking. They even draw on mainstream epistemologies to argue that the data cannot be falsified, citing Karl Popper, which is a clever argument. Instead of proof, the scientific community forms a consensus based on a large amount of evidence that points to climate change's statistical likelihood. But this is seen to be of lesser importance. As Klein concludes, it's not primarily opposition to the scientific facts that is driving this debate. Rather, it's the opposition to the real-world implications of the findings. Climate change, in short, threatens to detonate the ideological scaffolding on which conservatism rests. Klein concluded with this quite interesting passage. This is an article in The Nation. If you actually just Google her name and capitalism versus climate, you'll get this. She concludes with an interesting message for the political left. As she puts it, when it comes to the real-world consequences of those scientific findings, the deniers may be in considerably less denial than a lot of professional environmentalists who paint a picture of global warming Armageddon, then reassure us that we can avert catastrophe by buying green products and creating clever pollution markets. It's just here that constructivism helps us to understand the way the empirical climate data carry social meanings related to the social and political implications in what our man here, Professor Satoon, has interestingly called meaning wars. More specifically, we can see the way that such data is translated into political policy knowledge. That is, the way evidence of warming has to be converted into knowledge that fits and is interpreted by socio-political narratives. That the numbers carry a political message when they enter the policy debate. This can be seen by examining the history of the argumentation. In the early years, climate change was put forward as an issue of risk, but later then presented as a matter of national security. The data was implicitly translated into a form of knowledge that sought to portray the numbers as implying a specific existential threat to humanity. I'm not saying they don't, but I'm saying that the numbers don't say it itself. It's attached to a story. In this regard, climate change research has been as much implicated in how to get the issue on the political agenda as it was just about collecting the numbers, presenting the numbers, and so on. Rather than just functioning as an epistemic community, climate experts did more than just marshal data. They sought to politicize it by framing it as an issue of environmental security and human survival. That is, they transformed scientific facts into political facts as well for the political discussion. For climate deniers, this is portrayed as a scare tactic, perpetrated by a truth regime made up of climate scientists, elite politicians, and deep state bureaucrats. That's too far. I had something here on it, truth regime. Anyway, in this regard, climate deniers implicitly, if not explicitly, portray climate science in the public sphere as a social construction that fits with social and political meanings. It's not that they've done this because they took a course in sociology. They've actually just discovered how this works from a social constructivist perspective. Without spelling it out theoretically, they recognize that in the co-production of climate science, science is wrapped into a set of norms and institutions supported by the state that can be understood in Foucault's term, truth regime, or Jasanoff's term, similarly, a truth regime supportive of a particular society and its way of life. If there was enough time, I'd say more about the truth regime. That's something one could debate. But it suffices here to recognize that the climate deniers, whether we like it or not, are not entirely wrong to argue that climate science is connected, wittingly or unwittingly, to a political strategy. They correctly understand the societal implications to be big, but the discussions of them are never prioritized and fully considered openly and candidly in the public media. That is, the potential need for a planned society. That doesn't go over very well in the United States. A greater role for experts, and restraint on individual freedoms. It's not that the numbers are wrong, but they imply that these kinds of things have to be taken seriously. The point here is not that one side does this and the other doesn't. It's rather the nature of political knowledge, that we translate the numbers into narrative understandings. In the throes of political struggle, to borrow from Alistair McIntyre, the narrative story attached to the data becomes more important than the policy and its relevant numbers. So what does this mean for policy science? Whereas the discipline has adopted a fairly narrow empirical approach, and I think we had a good explication of those type 1 and type 2 in particular approaches, the discipline should extend its practices to include a focus on political narratives and the way they are emotionally embedded in the beliefs of the competing groups. It's not a question of what we want to believe, but for our job, it's to understand how this is actually working, this process. Toward this end, policy science needs to include the practices of what is called narrative policy analysis, something that roughly exists but is on the margins of the discipline and would never be taught in a policy science course that I'm aware of. But rather than just storytelling, the emphasis would be on how the empirical findings are interpreted in the competing narratives. In particular, how policy narratives give meaning to the findings of the different actors, how emotions influence these narratives. That's a whole topic itself, but I only have 15 or 20 minutes here. And how they govern the translations to political knowledge. That is, we need to see what the empirical findings mean for the policy narratives, what are the meanings of the social and political consequences associated with the policy facts. It's not to challenge the facts. For this, policy science requires a constructivist approach to narrative policy analysis. This means turning away from a neo-positive perspective. That's really, I didn't cover that, so we come here. And returning to the original Laswellian mission to help policymakers understand the socio-political context of the decisions that they have to make, both politicians but also citizens, including climate deniers who unfortunately are citizens. Have to concede it. Political scientists have largely failed to deal with the fact that they speak a language different than do the decision makers, as well as the way their findings are translated into political and policy knowledge by the competing perspectives. This has to be understood as an interpretive task that experts cannot make alone. The policy meanings have to be explored and tested through collective deliberation. We can't just assign these meanings ourselves. And of course, the point is that there are competing meanings. Needed then is a discursive form of narrative policy analysis that can interpret the climate findings as they relate to these stories. It also requires a discursive process that allows for the emotional expression of the narratives, for which there are actually some techniques, but beyond my time. So I just say finally, as a method for bringing facts to bear on the social and political concerns underlying climate denial, both cognitive and emotional, such a method, such a narrative policy analytic method would offer policy science a way to make a more relevant contribution in the effort to deal with this super wicked, thank you, political phenomenon. Thank you.
Yes, I just will give you the plan of my talk, and I apologize for my not so good English, not so fluent. So forgive me if I read a paper. I try to do it in the most readable manner. So what is this title a little obscure? I begin by the following observation. The analysis and the reflections on the ecological crisis, the climatic mutation, or the finiteness of the resources of the planet hardly arrive to become the basic elements of political visions of the future. They never succeeded, at least in our countries, to structure the national political debates at the time, for instance, of the elections in our countries. These analyses have always difficulties in making other features of the contemporary situation coexist. Question of work and employment or social protection, social inequalities, migration issues, questions of security or identity, and so on, which very often supplant the environmental concerns of the people in the world and prevent the political debate on them. And here I listed questions which are important in Western countries. Obviously, for other countries in the South, the problems would be extreme poverty, drinkable water, questions of pollution and poverty, and so on. So in my opinion, this tension between isolation of the climate problem and dissolution of it among the various other challenges that societies face is one of the main sources of the difficulties of its governance at all scales, and this at least for 30 years. So, is it possible to put a cursor between these two extremes and where it could be? Let's take a look back at the period of 1990 until 2010 and even later. The idea of sustainable development, which was supposed to keep together environmental protection, economic growth, and social concerns, was in 1992 at its peak. This project of fundamentally social democrat and ecological inspiration is part of a Keynesian line extended to the environment in the possibility of setting goals for the common good, a line which postulates that markets could be regulated, that it is necessary to think about life in common and to deliberate on it, which thinks it is useful to apprehend it first by collective thought, exchange, and reason. A project that could not fail to meet different economic and political logics and contradictory, logic of market and consumption, logics of entrepreneur and financier, who aspire to rapid returns on investment, etc. So, two universes collided, whose temporalities are profoundly different, since one privileges the long term and the general interest, and the other, the immediate utility, the constraints, and the interest here and now. So the two antagonistic projects clashed violently, and we know that the neoliberal conservative project won. However, the mythical idea and story of sustainable development continued, progressively emptied of any substance. It became a syntagm with contradictory meanings and demands. And since that time, multilateral arenas have always governed without really projecting ourselves into a desirable future. And recently, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted recently, they cannot draw any desirable future, at least in our countries, in the West developed countries. On the climate side, between Kyoto and Copenhagen, and even until Paris COP21, the governance has increasingly isolated the climate problem for other global issues, emphasizing the only environmental reading that has abandoned any idea of direct regulation by standards or rules or by an explicit industrial policy. Second, restricting the economic question to the only grammar of the carbon price in favor of an invisible coordination of actors by the prices and the markets of negotiable permits. And finally, deliberately ignoring the geopolitical aspects of the problem. So several social scientists, Mike Yule, the authors of the Hartwell paper, which are also converging with this question of the weak problem, in the United States, the Breakthrough Institute, and so on, severally criticized climate reductionism. They called climate reductionism of the climate governance, even that of IPCC. I don't share all these critiques, but I mention them. But a schism of reality has been at work for nearly 20 years in the face of climate risk. To it, a growing gap between an external reality, that of the globalization of markets, the exploitation unbridled of fossil fuels resources, and states caught up in a fierce economic competition, ever more attached to their national sovereignty. And on the other side, the sphere of negotiation and governance that is charged of an imaginary, of a great central regulator capable of defining and distributing emission rights, which was increasingly disconnected from this world external. Another aspect of this schism of reality is, for instance, the meteoric rise of the Chinese economy, whose growth has shaken many certainties within the climate regime and disrupted long-standing hierarchies of nation states, and inside the climate arenas, it was absolutely politically incorrect to discuss or to discuss of these questions. So despite criticism of the historical responsibility of Western countries, developing countries are engaged in the same pattern of growth than us and aspire to the same model, a predatory model, obviously, a situation all the more worrying for all together. Here also, the emergence of a desirable counter-model does not yet exist. What happened with the, sorry, I don't know why I am here. Let us come to the rupture of the Anthropocene. I don't want to enter in all the detail, but with the ecological crisis deepening, the diagnosis of the Anthropocene resonated as a realization of a rupture, an irreversible rupture. It constitutes at the same time a diagnosis, a scientific diagnosis, but also a general thesis, a cosmology, and a historical and prospective account. The Anthropocene seems destined to become the matrix of several distinct emergent futures. First, the different apocalyptic narrative of the future. Second, the future of degrowth or decrease. And finally, the hubris of the technological future of planetary geoengineering. Three stories that have diffused in the intellectual world, but have so far found very little place in natural debates, in national debates, or in the international arenas. The Anthropocene is the era of catastrophes, in the sense of a future very unstable, nonlinear, whose measured disturbances will be the norm. It's also the era of collapse, which can be as slow end of growth as brutal, like a risk of systemic collapse. But these visions of the future have not still found their place in the political stages or arenas. And I think it is clearly due to the catastrophic character, the followers of collapsology or the adepts or the apostles of the decline, to the scale of and the radicality of their positions carried by intellectuals or economists, but dissident and outside the established political field. Finally, since the Paris Agreement, 4 years ago now, one can say that climate problem has become, on one hand, a planetarian question, capable of crystallizing a series of issues, but on the other, the so-called climatization of the world has its limit and operates by intermittent poofs and disappear from COP to COP. So nevertheless, the recent European elections have seen in many countries an unprecedented success in the vote for the Green parties. And also there is an undeniable rise in the awareness of the environmental crisis and the climate risks. So there is, in my point of view, a window of opportunity, at least in Europe, but the climate geopolitics has never been so cleaved with several climate deniers in power. And we can mention Trump, but also Bolsonaro, and in Europe, far extreme right groups and parties, which are more or less at the power in some states in Eastern Europe or in Italy, and so on. Before coming to the project of the so-called ecological modernization, which is more or less implicitly the only reformist vision which emerged in climate arenas, I would like, if you allow me, to talk a little about what we experienced in France this winter. A period that seems very paradoxical, with a very violent popular revolt that started against the carbon tax, and at the same time, an incredible mobilization, cheering, in my point of view, of the youth of the world, and in particular the youth of France, to preserve the climate and the environment. It is the famous demonstration each Friday. In the expression of the ones as the others, the same slogan returns. End of the month, end of the world, same fight. For some, this means that social and environmental problems have a common origin. It is obviously much too simple and false. But in fact, what does it matter, really? In any case, this expresses the very strong feeling that we cannot advance on the environmental cause and climate cause without, at the same time, taking care of the social. The ecological transition will be solidary or will not be. Of course, there may be contradictions or conflicts between the different objectives, but there are also possible synergies, strong synergies. I give just one example, but you know much more than me. Thermal insulation of dwellings, a major issue for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in France, for instance, which also reduces the energy bill for households, especially the poorest, and should create many jobs that cannot be decayed. Some of our European neighbors have been able to industrialize the thermal renovation of buildings at a much higher rate than in France. So it's starting to be an important political debate on this point this winter. Another example, it would be necessary to generalize the zero-rate loan for all objects of the transition: insulations, heat pumps, electric vehicles, and so on. In his letter to the French, the President Macron asked some questions, among many others, about what sacrifices people could accept in their habits and lifestyles. But, in my point of view, the ecological transition is not a simple addition of points, of a few points among many others. On the contrary, it requires to offer a coherent and global project. The desirable evolution of habits and lifestyles is necessarily constrained by the general framework of the infrastructures proposed by the country, and determined also by the cultural values put forward by society and powers. So, constructing an economy or a society low carbon, as we said, is a profound transformation, both material and social, comparable to the great transformation described by Karl Polanyi for the Industrial Revolution. It cannot be apprehended in the individualist framework. What Polanyi shows is that after the metabolic shock of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, the states and the societies have been able to engender the democratic process to adapt to it, and this took several decades in the 19th century. But they also failed, for instance, to find the meaning of the search, a big search, for territorial protections. And the question of the earth in the sense of belonging to a soil, become toxic par excellence. It was the conservative and fascist movement in the beginning of the 20th century that perceived this concern, and we know what happened after. From this point of view, it is very striking that the revolt of the Yellow Vests in France, which put forward the questions of the territories, presents such analogies. So I come to the European level. In fact, one can consider the ecological modernization is likely an oxymoron. Its perspective for developed society is, if not to go back in an impossible transformation backwards, but to change the trajectory that these societies have borrowed since the industrial era, and to do it gradually. So this is why the prospect remains risky. Has it really started? Where it is already claiming to work, and could hardly carry total conviction. However, this vision was heard in the climatic arenas, in think tanks, carried by different actors and very personalities, lead authors of the IPCC, ministers of environment, think tanks, and so on and so on. The most complete and symptomatic example of this vision, in my point of view, has been the German report, World in Transition, a global contract for sustainability, that the think tank WGU diffused in Durban and after. But the first time I saw it, and I saw the impact it had at Durban at the COP number 11, I think. If this report was not so original in terms of analysis of the existing, it is more by its will to take into account all the dimensions, in particular also social and cultural, towards a new social contract. It is in the title. Among the technological aspects of the transformations, three main pillars are described in particular: that of the energetic transition and transportation system, that of the urban development, and that of the land use. To be more credible, in my point of view, the prospect of this transformation should fulfill at least three additional conditions. Do not pretend to any universal character. Indeed, it is first of all a way of solutions, plural and diversified for developed Western countries, and the South need the transformations and the policies are largely to invent for these countries, and we cannot do that for them. Second, include in the project the issue of adaptation, which is absolutely now crucial, given the inertia of the climate and the point where we are. And also the adaptation poses a lot of problems, technical, but also social, political, and ethical. And above all, the third condition for me is to include the judgment of certain sectors and economic activities or certain technologies, particularly aggravating the problem of the ecological degradation. We know that the history of energy, for instance, is more or less a story of energy addition rather than substitutions, and also small disinhibitions which added. So we have to really pose the crucial questions of how to stop certain technologies, certain ways of producing, certain ways to consume, and to influence others urgently. Engaging this transformation today is first and foremost a matter of investing in energy efficiency, renewable energies, industrial processes, organic farming, and healthy food eating. For these investments, tools exist, such as the European Investment Bank or the Climate Bank, whose French presidency took over the idea. Because yes, it needs money, a lot of money, to decarbonize the economy. Where to find it? In fact, money exists. We know that it exists, and it is not lacking at all. The CICE, the dividend of CAC 40 companies, long-term savings in search of safe investments, and the billions of that the European Central Bank has injected after the crisis of 2008. But we need to be able to steer it more towards ecological transformation. Some decision could be taken at the level of a national country as France, but I think that others need to be taken at the European level, which is crucial. It will be necessary to pull out, for instance, the investments of this ecological transition from the Maastricht criteria and manage to direct them, the money of the European Central Bank towards the energy transition. So this Green New Deal, which is behind this project, is in an in-depth rethinking of what is a debt. What is a debt? To give a certain space for maneuver in investment, and in short, it is rethinking the categories of the public accounting, as already the Stiglitz Commission suggested 10 years ago to meet the major challenge of climate change. In the end, it is also a question of relaunching the European project for and by the ecological transition, the only theme, in my view, likely to be able to reach consensus in Europe, to remove the reluctance of some of our neighbors, powerful neighbors, towards a greater European solidarity. And also, above all, it is the theme that we observed this last year, that can create in youth a new enthusiasm for the European project and hinder the return of nationalism and the rise of populism. So I just now say here, I want to remind this phrase of Ulrich Beck, who explained that the notion of our environment is either too narrow when it excludes the human and social action, or too wide and life-threatening when it includes it, because at that point it doesn't reflect politics at the deepest required changes. And all I have that in mind. So I want to achieve my lecture by, we know that further setbacks occurred recently. US President Donald Trump and certain elites in the American society have brought in the geopolitical scene an ignorant nationalist agenda to power, denied climate change, destroyed environmental regulation, and denounced the ideal of a common world that the post-World War II liberal dream and multilateralism have shared. I just want to, yes, I think that what President Trump declared, that we don't live on the same earth, we don't have the same values or the same interests. America first. That is the profound significance of this. So today, I think that the question of climatic mutation and its denial, the question of the neoliberal deregulations, which led to the vertiginous explosion of inequalities that raises so many problems, particularly in Europe, but also in United States, I think. And third, the question of territories correlative to the question of migrations, because they are linked. These questions are closely linked. These three questions seem to go well together. It is a convergent set that we only respond together, to it together. Bruno Latour says this. Bruno Latour is a philosopher and sociologist, a French philosopher that I am sure you know. And his thesis is that these three previous questions, yes, were created in the 90s because some of the American economic elite have perceived the climate threat in the sense of the planetary boundaries, and they decided to respond by denial, the abandon of solidarity and the flight to the enrichment of the 1% of the 1%. And this happened exactly at the beginning of the 90s and developed in these years. This is the thesis of Latour. I am not absolutely convinced of the lucidity of this elite at this point of the 90s, but I think that how do you say, thanks to Trump, people brutally realized that what they ignored for too long, that the climate issue is at the heart not only of environmental issues, but also of geopolitical issues. The main rivalry with China, but not only, with a lot of Russia and a lot of questions belonging to geopolitics, and directly related to the issue of injustice, inequality, and migration. The response of these three major problems that we face, rise of immigration and populism, rise of inequalities, and climate change are linked, and it is the same threat as I mentioned. And the link is what? Is the denial of climate change, and its imprint, and its profound meaning. So the arrow of the time of the moderns had led us to the ideal of progress and globalization. On another side, too long, ecologists defended the return to local, but a local conceived as folding and regression. And all that did not make a very enthusiastic program. So what Bruno Latour is the first, according to me, to engage seriously the way of holding together several of these problems and connecting them. And also he offers us a way to change the setting and horizon, how do we envision the future and the past, what is progressive and what is regressive or retrograde, how blurred the opposition, which we observed, between right and left and global and local, and finally, why we must operate not a change at 180 degrees, but at 90 degrees, and a turn that redefine all these categories and to find what he calls the terrestrial, because his book is landing, how landing in French, ou atterrir. I am not sure that it has been already translated, but he will be. I don't know exactly. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming and for staying with us and for delaying your post-conference drink another bit of time. I should maybe add that I find that thinking about climate policy does make one thirstier. So I warn you beforehand. Okay, I'm going to start by talking a bit about the challenges of doing climate policy. And it consists of three real-world challenges. One is its urgency. The second is that it requires global action. And now also, because we've delayed, it also requires continuous action. We really don't have time to go backwards for 5 years or 4 years or 10 years. In any large country. Maybe a little country could get away with it, and we would get to where we need to get to. It's urgent very much because not so much the denial and delay we engaged in, as because it will take no less than 30 years and possibly 50 years to achieve the low-carbon economy we need. I don't even think we can get to a no-carbon economy, but we can get to a low-carbon economy, but it can't really be done in much less time than that. So that being the case, policy scholarship too must act with urgency. We have to come up with usable policy ideas, saleable policy ideas, and we have to do it quite quickly. So I'm kind of encouraging you, despite the fear of alcoholism, to get into this field and use your expertise within it. You could say that there's no longer time on this policy front for Max Weber's slow grinding of hard boards, as he described science and social science in particular. We need to grind faster, I guess one might say. So let me just say, why is 30 years the minimum? A couple things are obvious. One is that the political resistance is strong to effective climate action from obvious sources. And the second is that the change required is thoroughly comprehensive. It affects everything we do, all our habits, all our devices, all our cities. Everything about it must be adjusted in some way or other. And there are three other things that suggest it's going to take a long time that are less obvious. One is that if you look historically, the earlier shifts from wood to coal and coal to oil and gas took 50 years each. And this switch is bigger because we're not just burning one thing instead of burning another thing, and the new thing is more efficient than the previous one. Coal more than wood, oil more than coal. We're not going to be burning anything much. And that's a very big adjustment to make. We're going to be electrifying almost everything. So, two other things. The things we must replace are all expensive, durable, and embody energy in their own production. Furnaces, vehicles, factories, power plants. If you just bought a new internal combustion engine car, you're not going to throw it away. It's going to take 10 to 15 years before it's used up the energy you've already embedded in it. So, that's why the time, and power plants take longer to use up the amount of money and energy that was put into making them. So, scrapping some things too early may cost as much fossil energy as it saves, because making them right now requires using it. The last thing on the list is there are some things at present we do not even know how to do without fossil fuels. Flying airplanes is one of them. There are a few little planes that can carry 1 or 2 people that are electric, but they don't go far and they can't bring any luggage. So mass flying of large numbers of people across oceans is not doable without fossil fuels at this point, and I haven't seen anyone suggest anything that's all that likely to work. Okay. The second challenge I can handle much more briefly, and that is that we need global action. I think that's apparent. But how often, we might ask, have virtually all nations ever acted in concert continuously over a long period of time? I stretched my brain going back to my international relations degree as an undergraduate student, and I couldn't come up with anything. There is a Paris Agreement, and that was a global agreement. We've hung on to all of the countries in it, but for one minor one to our south, which is becoming great again. But how many countries are living up to it? One, I'm supposed to insert some Canadian content here. I would suggest that Canada is one of those that has not lived up to what it agreed to. Though 8 or 9 out of the 10 provinces have. But the one province that hasn't, most decisively, tips the whole country out of compliance. It's one that's making, pumping, processing lots and lots of oil and using a whole lot of energy to do it because it's thick and it has to be heated before it can be separated from the sand. And they heat it with natural gas. Anyway, so Canada's not in compliance, not for not trying in a lot of places and succeeding in many. Okay, the last of the challenges is that it must be continuous, and I think in many ways that's the toughest one, and I think it's the one that leads us to where the policy strategy needs to go. The power, and one of the reasons it must be continuous is that the power and desperation of what might be called legacy industries, fossil fuel industries, they're still with us for sure, but they may not be for more than another half a century at the outside, though there still would be petrochemicals, presumably, but that's less than 10%. And the financial institutions with overextended fossil fuel lending. I think that has a lot to do with Canada's non-compliance. Okay, the other is the so-called, euphemistically called populism. This links us back to the first plenary, and I think there is a real connection. There's recently been a reversal of climate actions in a number of countries and jurisdictions, and they include the United States, Brazil, Ontario, and Alberta. And there is a connection between populism. 2 of those 4 were driven by populism. Ontario's close to being driven by populism, a little less racially inclined or anti-immigrant as some of the others might be. But recent Canadian events do show how bad it can get. I'll just give you a couple of examples for local color of what the new Conservative government, now 1 year old, thank God, there's only 3 to go, has done about climate. It rejected the carbon tax that the federal government is pushing. It not only rejected it, but it uses taxpayer money to fund television advertising, denying the need for a carbon tax, which is awesome when you think about it. I'm going to ask for a refund of my tax dollars. And it also even applies advertisements at the pump at gas stations, suggesting, oh my God, do you know how much tax you're paying? I have I was going to say I have a bumper sticker on my electric car saying, carbon tax me. But I'm kind of afraid somebody's going to take out my windshield in retaliation. Anyway, I didn't drive to get here, so you can't get the car. Anyway, those are some of the, a couple other things they've done is remove electric car chargers at some train stations. They'd spent money to get rid of something the previous government did. It sounds very much like Donald Trump. They go to a lot of trouble to undo whatever was done. Okay. The last bit of why continuous is a challenge, I think, is in many ways a bigger one, but it's down the road 10 or 20 years when we're actually being effective and demand for oil is falling fairly dramatically. Let's imagine in the best of all possible worlds, it's 30–40% less than it is now. What's going to happen? I think what will happen is that the price of oil will fall. Some countries can produce oil for almost nothing. It's just a little bit of sand to scrape away, and there it comes. So what the temptation will be very great during recessions to haul that old gas car out of the barn and fill it up. And other, in poor nations particularly, when considering development planning, to say, oh my goodness, it's cheaper with oil than it is with all these windmills we've been paying for. It could happen. I mean, I think that's something that has to be kept in mind, and it really challenges the globalness of the action. I mean, wealthy countries can afford to do it. Other ones might not be able to afford to do it and be competitive. So anyway, to end that section of the talk, all of these political challenges must guide policy strategies and designs. And I've come to a few conclusions about this from having done a long review that has only found publication in short things. I'm working on a book, but the first one was done. I finished it just before Trump came to power, and it was somebody told me the first optimistic book I'd ever written. And then Trump came along, and I thought, well, this is kind of off the mark. So I'm revising. Anyway, from that look at who's done what about getting down to a low-carbon economy, what has been successful and what hasn't in all kinds of countries. I found that national governments are needed to do certain crucial things: carbon pricing, post-carbon infrastructure, things like high-speed rail, the national electricity grid revision. Those things really only at least national governments have to have a significant role within. They also need to do things about funding adaptation. It's just so capital intensive to move cities from one place to another or to build a wall around them if they're going under. And research funding needs to be at least in part national. But sort of aside from all those things national governments do need to do, many of the carbon actions that have been successful have been advanced by consumers, small entrepreneurs, large corporations, institutions, public mostly, civil society, and local government. So the policies should focus on empowering these multi-level public and private efforts. Government policies, I think that's important. The policy must anticipate that, otherwise national inertia can be lost during the periods where denialist regimes are in power. We have to face it, there will be denialist regimes in many countries on and off over a 30 to 50-year period. It's almost unavoidable, especially in countries that have a large oil industry, an influential one, anyway. The wonderful thing about all of these diverse activities in other entities within society is that as they grow, they build a resistance constituency. They are vested in, if you're a small solar entrepreneur installing solar panels on rooftops, you're not likely to vote for somebody who's going to put a tariff on imported solar panels. It's just not going to happen. And the person who put the solar panels on my rooftop was pretty clear about that. He said, you know, people who get into that kind of business are smart. He's a, trained engineer and construction person. He can do these things. Okay, I'm going to give a few examples. I think I'm about half my time. A few examples of the non-governmental and local government initiatives, just to give you a feel for the range of things that actually exist out there. The first is just a statistical thing. In the United States, the number of farms is declining fairly rapidly and has been for a very long time. That is, there are just as many acres planted, but the farms are bigger and bigger. The small farms tend to go under. But in a recent five-year period, the number of organic farms in the face of this decline increased by 27%. The value of organic sales in the same period was up 84%. So organic, which needs fossil fuels, avoids the need for fossil fuels, has grown. Similarly, local food has grown, small farmers supplying local markets. The number of farmers markets in the United States was 74% increased in a similar five-year recent period. So, many new small growers have gained access to land. And a lot of this is driven by consumer choice. People are choosing, many are doing it for climate change reasons. Others are doing it for all kinds of other reasons. But the point is, the trend is there in the market. Also, some of these new producers are extremely innovative. I've been to a few of them, not to the one I'm going to mention, but they can grow year-round vegetables in unheated greenhouses. That is, there's no natural gas heating them. That the sun heats them, and the way they're positioned and shaped keeps them warm enough in Ontario for 10 and a half months of the year, which if you've lived in Ontario, you know is pretty amazing. That you can grow spinach in December, when the snow's usually about that deep, with a little ice on top of it. And they've even gotten semi-year-round, sort of 8-month vegetable production as far north as the Yukon. I find that amazing, since the sun isn't out for a couple months. Anyway, that's an example of the kind of innovation that is going on, and all of it reduces fossil energy demand, because otherwise the vegetables would be coming from Mexico or California, and you'd be, a very high percentage of the fossil energy used in their production would be in getting them from there to here. Whereas now they're being produced and consumed within a matter of a few kilometers. Okay, I'll just one quick note on renewable energy, another area which is sort of market-based. Now it's the case in Canada that 300,000 people work in clean energy sector. About 100,000 more than work in the oil and gas extraction and mining combined, which is rather remarkable, since the great complaint is you're going to ruin jobs for people if we phase out oil. I think quite the opposite is the case. You're going to increase the number of jobs. Okay. I also had a lot more commentary, but I'll just throw in a sentence. Solar and wind energy distribute income far more broadly than does fossil energy, both geographically and in terms of social class. For a whole lot of reasons. I won't give you all the details so that I do keep to my time. Okay, two other things worth mentioning in this complex non-national government sector. There are institutionally based initiatives, particularly universities, hospitals, even churches have done an awful lot to reduce their carbon footprint. There's a poster out there showing one of the things they're doing here. A couple I'd mention is there are hospitals in Allentown working with the Rodale Institute, which is an organic farming based firm that's been and publisher for the last 50 years. They're growing organic produce on hospital land to supply food for patients. Food Share in Toronto is a very large nonprofit that redistributes excess food from business events and supermarkets to families in need, avoiding food waste. And they do it by the dozens, if not hundreds of tons a year. There are 80 employees of this nonprofit. Okay, I'll just throw out local government. I think most people understand what it can do and why it's important. One of the greatest authorities it has, and national governments don't necessarily have it themselves, is zoning. You can, if you want a more compact city and less sprawl, you can adjust zoning such that you can build up. If you look around you in Montreal, it's certainly happening here. If you're in that dense area, life is easier without a car. My 40-year-old son lives in downtown Toronto. He not only doesn't have a car, he doesn't have a driver's license. He takes transit, he rides a bike, he walks. It's easy, it's easier. Try parking anywhere in downtown Toronto, you know. So zoning is an important power, and the other ones are all fairly obvious. Infrastructure, transit, procurement. One of the important political facts is that the power of oil companies in Texas and Saudi Arabia have damned little influence over a city council that's 3,000 miles from either, or more, from either place. But local businesses are created by carbon reduction. Solar panel installers and a whole array of others, retrofitters of various kinds. And they have influence on local city councils. So if, you know, we're gonna, in the places where national governments reject progress, it can continue in other jurisdictions. And in fact, there are hundreds of US mayors who have signed pledges to meet the Paris Agreement anyway, within their jurisdictions. Okay, so the policy outcome of this is that what are needed are opportunity structures that can accelerate dispersed citizen, small business, municipal, institutional initiatives. Obviously, carbon pricing is one of them, you know, on the national level, but there are a whole range of other things that can be done, anywhere from providing retraining opportunities to public funding for rental land for farmer startups, that is creating more local farmers that supply locally by using public funding for land. There's a group in Ontario that is working hard on the federal government to use the 25,000 acres put aside for a second Toronto airport to be developed as small farms serving the Toronto community, which is within 10 miles of where that airport would be. Okay, there are also obviously all kinds of measures that could be taken, opportunity structures at the local level, like property tax initiatives for installing solar panels over parking lots, also keeping the snow and ice off your car at the same time. And maybe the other one, there's a long list I have, but I won't run through them all. The point is that this is a strategy of action, not just federal grand action, but local actions. One of the very interesting ones is European, and that there are 2 or 3 cities, one in France, I can't remember which one, which offer free public transit. There are other communities that offer free public transit on Sundays. Free, there's variations on this. Free public transit could be very, very expensive, but there are limited ways it could be done. It could be given to selective groups of people by income. It could be done in all kinds of other ways. Okay, I'd also throw in that the Green New Deal, which looks to look at inequality, reduction, and climate action simultaneously, because there are overlaps, is another way to move forward. And one of the things that's important about this, even without a Green New Deal, but with it, is that building a low-carbon economy creates non-retail, non-automatable, non-exportable jobs in food, in research, in infrastructure, in energy installation, home renovation. The New Democratic Party, which, if you're not from Canada, is a social democratic party, is calling for, in its campaign for this fall's election, retrofitting all Canadian buildings for energy efficiency by 2050. The union movement is very keen on this. It would create huge numbers of jobs, but obviously the lowest cost way to get carbon reduction is actually energy efficiency, not replacing it with renewable energy. Okay. I'll just get to the last section then by way of conclusion. Communicating climate action urgency and possibilities is the title of the section. Time. I thought we were getting there. I just would advocate, one of the things I would advocate is after you get your article on climate change policy in a respectable journal, take another take on it and aim it at a wider audience, do an op-ed, put it online, do something else, communicate it to citizens and communicate why it's important. I think this is it's a duty of scholars when the world is facing a problem of this size. So that's a sort of an advocacy point. We need to design and communicate no regrets climate policy actions that will be seen as worthwhile even by citizens uncertain about climate change. That is, there are side benefits associated that have to be communicated about climate actions. There are environmental side benefits in terms of air and water quality, and there are numerous social gains. There are more skilled, stable jobs, opportunities, there are more livable cities, and there is greater rural prosperity. I mean, as a counter to populism, I think that's quite crucial. There are more jobs, the solar panels and the wind. Where are the most wind turbines being built in America now? Texas. And that they are certainly not doing it because they're worried about climate change. Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much. I think we will, if we have questions, I think you can probably come over and ask of our participant. Time is flying. We took our 2 hours, however, so it's was part of that. So anyhow, we have you can write a question, I think, to everyone. So I pass the flag.
Okay, just 1 minute, please. Just 1 minute, if you can wait 1 minute. Shams, you have what I... So, wow. I just want to... I'm sorry. They have unfortunately opened the bar before I ask, so sometimes it's arrived. Everything is not perfect. I just want to say a word to conclude. As you know, Guy Peters was the first chair of the first roundtable of the first International Conference on Public Policy. So Grace, who become president today, unfortunately need to leave for personal reasons. But he was the first founding president during the first year of the association. And in the name of everyone in the room, we would like to give him an award to conclude and to finish this roundtable and this fourth ICPP. Thank you, Guy.